Hi everyone, this is USCF expert Karana. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at some of the games that happened in round 4 of the Sinquefield Cup and the Cairns Cup, both of which are annual events that are hosted by the St. Louis Chess Club for open and women's chess players. We get to see some of the top chess players in the world duke it out in high-level classical games. So without further ado, let's get into it. Just a note, I am hiding the results of the games so that they don't pop up when the games are on their initial screens. However, when I switch tabs and the game goes to the end screen, it may reveal the final position. So just in case, try not to look at it too deeply. I'll try to go to the beginning of the game as quickly as I can. For this video, we will be looking at 5 games, and let's get into it. Also, big shout out to Agadmator, who is making some of his own recaps on this event. One of the reasons that I'm making my own recaps here is because I haven't seen many other YouTubers other than him post consistent uploads on these tournaments, which I believe are very high-profile events that many chess players and chess fans want to follow. So let's go ahead and get into it. Here we have a game between Pragg and Jorden. Pragg had a okay start with 1.5 out of 3, where he drew Sam in the first round, and then he had a very nice win against Javikir Sindarov, the upcoming World Chess Championship challenger, and then he lost to Vincent Keimer in a very well-played game by Vincent, while Jorden was at 0.5 out of 3, having lost to Fabi and Wesley in the first 2 rounds, and then he drew against Levon in round 3. So let's go ahead and check out what happened. So in this game, we started with e4 and had a Sicilian defense, and Jorden chose to employ this e6 system, and Pragg went into this d3 variation, which often is a sign that he's going to be playing for g3, bishop to g2, and playing it like a King's Indian type setup. So Jorden tries to strike at the center immediately, and Pragg plays queen to e2, essentially kind of doing a positional threat here, where if black simply develops like knight c6, then he wants to take on d5 so that black is obliged to take with the queen, and now black doesn't have central control as easily. He'd rather have the pawns on c5 and d5, but obviously he can't in this case because the king would be under fire. So this is not what happened in the game. Instead, we got knight to f6 and g3 as mentioned, bishop to e7, and pawn to a4, which is just to take space on the queen side, pawn to b6, bishop to g2, bishop to b7, and one of the nice things about this opening is that you get out of theory very quickly. At least there are so many possible move orders that it's very difficult to have quick preparation in all of the possible variations. So we get to move bishop to f4, and what happens here is that Pragg is sacrificing this pawn on e4 to get active counterplay. So d takes and bishop takes e4, you get knight to c3, and as you can see, at the moment, we have 4 developed pieces, and then maybe you can count the queen as 5 for white, while black only has 3. And white will be getting this rook to the d file with tempo, so white has some initiative in compensation for the sacrificed pawn. After the move bishop to c6, maybe bishop to b7 was a little bit better, just to ensure that this knight on b8 would still have the c6 square available. I think that probably would have been slightly preferred by the engine. It's very difficult to evaluate as a human though, so bishop to c6 also makes quite a bit of sense. And we get to move knight to b5. Rook to d1 was also playable, but knight to b5 was actually a stronger move, just trying to immediately threaten on c7, so that black would be forced to castle, and now knight c7 actually wins the exchange. So white actually is arguing now that even though they had a development advantage, they're fine cashing that in um, because they're spending some time bringing this knight into the position. They're fine cashing that in for material compensation, so that they end up being a point of material with a rook for a piece and a pawn. In this position, we get knight to d5, and after rook to d1, we have knight takes f4. You might be wondering why knight takes a8 was not played. It's kind of a subtle reason, and just to understand, so on rook to d1, knight takes f4, the problem is that rook takes d8, and bishop takes d8 is actually a possible variation. And here we would have a queen for a rook and a bishop. So that would give white some very practical winning chances. However, in the variation where rook to d1, where knight takes a8 is immediately played, knight takes f4, the problem is that you can't, you can't take on d8 because this rook is not on d1 yet. And white does not simply want to be up the exchange because black actually does have some decent activity with these bishops. Its compensation and the double pawns could prove to be a bit of a nuisance. So rook to d1, and maybe queen c8 was also possible, in which case knight takes a8 would also be playable, but knight takes f4 was the best move according to the engine here, and we get rook takes d8, bishop takes d8, bishop takes f4, and if you count the material at the moment, after bishop takes c7, it is equal, but white has a queen for a rook, piece, and pawn, and what will be happening is that after castles, knight to d7, knight to e5, knight to e5, just a note, black could have captured on f4, but it would have just been a move that may have conceded a bit of time, and something like e5 here would have had to been played because the pieces are a little bit loose, and then like rook to d1, white would get pretty active here, and maybe, for example, knight takes, I think knight takes e5 at the moment is almost a threat. It's not a threat quite yet because this bishop is defended, but in many cases there's stuff like knight takes f7 that can happen, and then rook to d8, which is probably why Jorden did not want to go for that. So instead he chooses to play knight to d7, and we get knight to e5, offering a trade of bishops. Jorden obliges, and then knight to f6, pawn to c4, pawn to g6, and Pragg just has a relatively pleasant position. Both players are getting a little bit lower on the clock now. They're both around 25 minutes, and they are at move 20, so they have to make 20 moves to get to time control. And we have the move knight to h5, queen to e4, rook to d8, knight to d7, and suddenly black is actually in a little bit of trouble. So rook to e8 would have been the best move, and probably Jorden did not like the fact that queen to b7 was allowed, and now bishop to d8, and a5, and kind of the position is becoming a little bit on the edge. It's not so clear how black is going to be proceeding because white is creating some concrete threats. King f1 is a little bit better here. Bishop to e5 is apparently the best move because if captured, then rook takes d1 would be a mate. It would actually be a checkmate. But after something like, it's actually not so clear what white's idea is in this position. So maybe if something like h5, then I guess white is simply going to be taking on a5. Also, I guess there's maybe knight to f6 check here, which is possible. But the thing is that it's not actually winning material because knight takes e8 isn't possible. So maybe that's the point of queen takes a5, where knight to f6. Now there would be rook takes d8. So probably that's why Jorden was a little bit uncomfortable with that position. However, the problem is that after knight takes f4 check, King to f1 was played. Maybe king f3 would have actually been very, very dangerous for Jorden, or after something like, I guess the question really is, what is white's threat? And the threat is queen b7 now. Oh, sorry. Queen b7 now is actually quite comfortable because there is knight takes f8 here when the king's on f3, because now rook takes d1 is not a mate, and now we would have something like this, and then queen takes b8, and this would be completely winning for Pragg. And what happens instead is Pragg plays king to f1. Sorry, Pragg plays king to f1, and after king to g7, Jorden actually had to play the move pawn to f6 here and kind of accept a little bit of a weakened structure, which is not easy. But after king to g7, the move queen to b7 is played, and Jorden is in a big amount of trouble, where this bishop is hit at the moment, and bishop to e5 could be played, or bishop to b8. Bishop to b8 was played in the game. However, after king to e1, just protecting this rook, now this knight on d8 can, this knight on d7 can move, but also queen f3 maybe was a strong move that could have been included first, and then maybe knight to, king to e1. It's not so clear what the big difference is, but I guess the point is that now knight takes b8 could be a threat, and queen takes f4 would happen. But after bishop to b8, king to e1, rook to e8, we have knight takes b8, rook takes, and now queen takes a7, and white is simply beginning to win material. We get rook to a8. Not sure why Pragg didn't decide to just take on b6 here. Maybe he didn't like something with maybe e5 and just some kind of ambiguous play, but objectively this would have maybe been the absolute best way of playing. However, he chooses to not take the pawn and go queen c7, and e5 is still played. Queen takes b6, and after pawn to e4, rook to d7, black is starting to create their own counterplay. King to e2 is played. It's an important move because if king to d2, then there is this move knight to e5, and the threat is knight takes c4, and the threat is on the rook, so white would actually be losing here. So king to e2 is played, noticing that nuance, and after rook takes a4, queen to b7, we have a threat on the f7 pawn, and knight to e5, rook to e7, rook takes, queen takes, and now Pragg is really just in a winning position because the activity of the two rooks isn't going to be a problem in the long term anymore, so Pragg is quite safe with the queen versus the rook and the knight, even though this pawn on e4 could create some potential ideas of like a mating net. It's kind of hard to really concretely achieve, and ultimately we get knight takes c4, queen takes c5, and knight takes b2, and queen e5 check. And you may be wondering why queen takes b2 doesn't happen, but the reason is actually because this position after rook to a5 is kind of a fortress. Namely, this rook can actually just try to move on f5 and h5, which is very surprising that this could even work, but it actually does. It's a trick that Jorden was likely hoping Pragg might fall into. You notice, effectively, if we get something like this, there's just really no way for white to break through, even though they have a queen for the rook. Just the fact that this rook is able to completely control this rook means that this white king will never be able to cross over, and this queen will never be able to accomplish anything on its own. It could maybe try to sacrifice for the rook, but ultimately it would just be a completely symmetrical position. And you can't really try to create some counterplay with the h pawn or the f pawn just because the rook would just captured, and there's no real issues. So very creative idea by Jorden there, but Pragg does not fall into it. Instead, he does it in a slightly different way, where now after rook to a5, after queen takes b2 check, the thing is that Jorden isn't able to get rook a5 in because queen takes b2 is a check. So because he doesn't allow Jorden to actually set that up in time, now after queen to e5 check, this position is objectively winning. Noting that after something like king to g8, there would be queen to e8 check, picking up this rook on a4. So king to f8 had to be played, and now simply queen h8, and we get a slightly different version of this position, where even though this rook can go to a5 and try to stay on f5 and h5, it's not a fortress in this case because this e-pawn will eventually fall, and with queen and 2 versus rook and 2, the queen can always at least sacrifice for the rook to get into a winning pawn endgame, with the king also capturing the pawn. So that is really the difference, which Pragg was able to understand. He spent some 3 minutes, because this, or no, yeah, so here he had, actually I'm a little bit confused because this was move 41, so they should have gotten the time, the extra time added here. Maybe the clocks are incorrect, but after queen h7 we had this position, and queen to e8 check, queen to c6 check, h5, and ultimately Pragg is able to slowly grind down Jorden in this position. It is a rook and a pawn, which can sometimes be a fortress, but in this case the pawn is just so weak that the queen will eventually be able to force some threats on the black king and the rook that will leave the pawn stranded. So we get king to g5, and here effectively the problem is that if something like king to e6, then we just have queen to e3 check, and something like king to d6, we can just play king to f6 and play queen to e6, then king to c5, and at some point, so basically you just play it like a queen endgame, a queen versus rook endgame, where this pawn just exists, but the queen and rook king can just try and directly checkmate. So if something like this, just for the sake of example, you can play, so queen e6 checks right here would not be playable because obviously rook to d6, but queen to b3 would be strong. Now if you try to play like this, then there is queen to b6, king to d7, queen to e6, and picking up the rook. So effectively the point is that with the king on f6, you have these ideas of separating the king and rook from the pawn, because otherwise the rook can sometimes hang in a lot of the lines. Ultimately what happens is that we get king to g5, and Jorden plays f4 check, understanding that he won't really be able to hang on to the pawn. So we get captures, and Pragg simply is in a winning position with queen versus rook, which he is able to convert. Queen versus rook endgame is often considered one of the most difficult endgames in chess, but if you understand all the right patterns and the rosette ideas, and you have concretely analyzed a few of the variations, so if you know how to win a position where the pieces are all on these squares, and you checked all the possible lines that could happen, you know the Philidor position. Those are the main things that you need in order to understand how to win those kinds of variations. And also there's some other patterns that can happen as well, some zigzag patterns and some checker patterns, but in general the point is just to try and bring the king closer without allowing stalemate traps. With some practice you can win this kind of endgame against an engine pretty consistently. I have been able to do so myself when I practice the endgame. So just kind of a piece of advice out there for anyone that is a little bit unsure on how to win these positions. Okay, so we get king to b6, and after queen to d5 check, we have king to c6. I think actually there's a forced winning of the rook here with queen to h5 check, and if king to d7, that's the only move that could potentially hold on, because so on these two moves, there's queen g5 and queen to h6, picking up the rook, and if here there is queen to, I think, sorry, so this, there should be queen to g5, rook to e7, and king to c6, and actually it's a checkmate, because after this there would be queen to g8 mate, and after king to c8, you can always take the rook. So it's effectively a zugzwang. And lastly, if king to d7, then there is queen to b5 check, and now the king is either forced here, where the rook would get skewered, or it is going to be going to a dark square or getting so if it goes here, then obviously we have queen to c5 check, picking up the rook here, so it has to go to a dark square, but this would get forked, this would get forked, and here queen to g5 check, and we have the same situation with king to c6. So Pragg did have a forced win there, but probably he had he understood a different path forward anyways. And here we get queen to f5 check, where Jorden just ends up resigning the game. If the king goes to the g file, then there's queen to g5 check, so the only possible move here would be king to e8, but queen h5 would actually end the game, I believe, because you have to go here or here or here, and the problem is that on these two moves, king f8 and king to e7, there's just queen to g5 check and queen h6 check. So this would have to happen, but then we just get this same situation of king to d8, and this would be simply winning. So for that reason, Jorden ended up resigning after queen to f5 check. Both players had a reasonable amount of time left on the clock, so it was pretty clear that the position would be converted, and Pragg scores another very nice win against Jorden. Jorden continues a bit of a struggling tournament where he has half a point out of 4. Pragg is now at 2.5 out of 4 and is doing relatively well. Alright, so actually that is all we have for the Sinquefield Cup for those games, because the rest of the games were actually quite uneventful for the most part. They were just draws. Levon Wesley drew, Maxime Vaishali versus Sinquefield was a draw, Nish played Sindarov, and that was a draw. Sam Savine played Fabiano, that was a draw. So all those games ended up being draws, and just take a look at the standings. We ended up having Wesley at 3, MVL at 2, Levon at 2, Pragg at 2.5. So they're all tied for second. Fabi, Vincent, Sam at 2, and Anish and Sindarov at 1.5, and then Jorden in last with half point. So still really anyone's tournament, maybe other than Jorden, but we have some very high level games, and I look forward to seeing some really nice matchups in the upcoming rounds. And let's move on to the Cairns Cup, which actually had quite a few more interesting matchups. And the first one that we'll be taking a look at is a game between Zhongyi and Vaishali. So Zhongyi was the last Women's Chess Championship challenger, and Vaishali will be challenging for the title this time around. So it'll be interesting to see how these two fare against each other. Tan is having a very good tournament with 2.5 out of 3, while Vaishali is struggling a little bit. She has 1 out of 3. with the loss against Divya and 2 draws against Bibisara and the International Master Stavroula Sola Kidu, sorry. And in this game we had knight to f3, pawn to d5, pawn to c4, and we got a regular English opening, which is, I guess, referred to as the Neo-Catalan. We have castles and knight to e5, which is kind of a rare move. Typically here you just see a transposition into the regular Catalan because it's the classical, and black did not get to play in a modern style with bishop to b4 check. So that's why you typically see the move d4 here, because it's a good move order for white. But Tan evidently wanted to make things a little bit sharp out of the opening, so she chose to play the move knight to e5. And after pawn to c5, played by Vaishali, we get pawn to d3. And you may be asking, okay, so is this a forced queen trade after d takes c4? D takes c4. The problem with the queen trade is that this is actually just an unpleasant endgame for black, where white is simply quite a bit more active and can try to exploit some of the weaknesses by targeting, for example, the pawn on c5, by playing bishop to e3, doing so as well, and maybe b3, bishop to b2 is also a way of developing the bishop. Just generally, black is kind of having some trouble developing their own pieces, so white is doing very well. For that reason, we see Vaishali play queen to c7, trying to avoid the endgame a little bit, and hit the knight. We get pawn to f4, rook to d8, queen to e1, and here we get the move pawn to d4, which is actually kind of a positional error by Vaishali. She should have done was just slow play the position with something like knight to d7 and tried to put some pressure on the e5 knight, forcing it to maybe go back to f3 if it wants to stay on the board. Knight to d7 would also be possible, but maybe this kind of allows black to just stay solid. And on knight to f3, this position is just generally quite decent for black because they have avenues of opening up a position like pawn to b5, c takes, and pawn to a6, where after this, black is actually doing quite well. This is kind of similar to a Benko or Blumenfeld gambit, where black is giving up these 2 pawns, but in exchange has very, very active play against the weakened position of white. And the reason that this version is so good is because after something like knight to c3, rook to b8, king to h1, rook c to d8, rook d to c8, sorry, and say knight to d1, what happens is that we get the c4 break in a position which ultimately opens everything up. So even though white is up a pawn here on the queen side, these pawns are really never going to advance because of just how active black is. And white should be trying to keep the position closed with the move pawn to d4, but in this case we would get something like knight to e4, and now this e4 square is permanently weakened and black can play for stuff like c3. This extra pawn on the queen side is really not doing all that much. And the white bishop is also walled in by the d5 pawn, so black would be doing quite well there, but also not an easy plan to conceptualize and really understand, to be perfectly honest. So it makes sense that the players did not want to go for this. Instead, Vaishali plays pawn to d4, which is, however, inaccurate positionally, just because after something like bishop to d2, you're now a little bit weakened on the b4 square, so now something like pawn to b4 could come in. I think after, say, a waiting move, there's even stuff like knight to a3 and knight to b5, trying to immediately punish the play. Though it's not exactly obvious what the nuance is with pawn to d4. I guess maybe the point is you just want to make sure this rook could have had some avenues to potentially opening up with d takes c4, but again, not an easy thing to understand. So instead of pawn to h6, we get the move d takes e3. So sorry, we get the move pawn to e4 and d takes e3, which was also a little bit inaccurate by Tan. She should have just tried to play for bishop to d2, and after like rook f8, just played for bishop a5 and argued that this is a bit of a weakened position for black, given that the white queen has some issues finding a good square. I guess the difference with something like this, just to take a look, if bishop to d2 here, knight b to d7, bishop to a5, there is just b6. So I guess the main point is that now after having pushed this d-pawn, this white bishop actually opens up and has an indirect threat on the black rook. Again, not an easy thing to really understand without having the engine. So after d takes e3, knight to c3, knight to d7, we had queen takes e3, pawn to a6, and this is a bit of a slow move by Vaishali, where likely she should have just decided to take on e5 and try to play this situation with knight to g4, queen to e2, and taken on e5. She probably didn't like this because of bishop f4, but there is pawn to f6, and even though white could double the pawns, it's not really a good way of playing because ultimately black is a pawn up, and something like bishop to f6 can defend the pawns quite well. White only has a light squared bishop, so they can't easily put pressure on the pawn on the dark squares. For that reason, maybe she thought that bishop to d6 was playable, but then, or rather that bishop to d6 wasn't playable because knight to b5 would come in, but f6 would actually have been quite fine for Vaishali. But instead she goes for a slow approach with pawn to a6, and here maybe Tan could have played the move queen to e2 and tried to play for something like knight takes e5, f takes e5, and knight to d7, and bishop f4. Maybe this was possible. Just generally trying to keep this bishop available for these other squares. But we get the move pawn to a6, rook to e1, and b3, bishop to d7, and really the main issue here is that the position for black is actually just quite passive, where the bishops on d7 and e7 don't really have a big role. Probably Vaishali wants to get a bishop to c6, but she can't really do so quite easily at the moment because the knight would simply capture and cause some positional weaknesses. So Tan has quite a nice position here. She's also up about 20 minutes on the clock, and she's definitely putting some pressure. Bishop to e8 is played here, and now after rook to e2, knight to d7, knight f to d7, knight to g4, Tan is just maneuvering slowly, trying to put some pressure, and she gets some additional center control. Though this maybe wasn't the best way of playing, it's kind of practical. And after pawn to b5, knight to g4, pawn to f6, queen to c3 was played, and maybe this was a little bit inaccurate because she now allows b takes c4. Also, maybe b4 was playable. Also, maybe a5 could have been interesting, but queen to c3 doesn't actually really carry much of a threat. So maybe she should have gone for something like pawn to f5 and argue that after e5, rook to c2, she's kind of putting some pressure on the c file, but not really clear what the absolute best approach would have been. So queen to c3 is played, b takes c4, b takes c4, and rook to d4. Now after queen to c2, we get queen to d7, pawn to e5, bishop to a4, and after queen to c3, black is actually in quite a bit of trouble. It might not seem obvious why that is, but actually the main reason is because this rook on d4 is nearly trapped. It doesn't really have any clear squares that it can go to other than maybe d3, but again, it's kind of in no man's land. So Vaishali plays rook to b8, and note that Tan is kind of playing quite quickly and ends up putting Vaishali in a very big time crunch. Here, Vaishali still has 14 moves to go till time control with only 37 seconds on the clock, and rook to b8 is actually inaccurate, where after he takes f6, after he takes f6, we get rook 8, we get knight to f2, pawn to f5, pawn to g4, bishop to f6, and now queen to g3. And Vaishali decides to go for a rook sacrifice on b2. She played this move with 1 second on the clock, I believe, because you get 30-second increment. So rook takes b2, rook takes c4, and maybe what Vaishali missed here was that rook to b7 is simply saving material loss, because the rook on a1 cannot be captured with the tempo move. So after queen to d8, we get g takes f5 check, king to h8, and now simply rook 8 to b1, and Tan Zhongyi is in cruise control. We do get the move bishop to d4, trying to create some counterplay, and after king h1, even though you can take, that would simply be blundering queen to g7 checkmate. So after bishop to c2, we get the move rook to b8, and Vaishali here plays e takes f5, but this allows queen to h5, and now queen to e7 is played, and the problem is that rook to e8 comes in, and this knight is not going to be defendable after the next move of rook to b7, because it will be captured, and then queen to h7 will be mate. Note that this rook on c3 can't really participate in creating immediate counterplay, so this is simply a direct mating threat for Tan, and maybe you could try to hold on with something like pawn to h6, but just rook to f7, and then the knight does simply fall. So a very nice win by Tan, just putting some slight positional pressure throughout the game against Vaishali. Maybe some moments that there could have been slightly more accurate moves, but very difficult to understand all the nuances, and ultimately Tan does get the job done. So Tan was at 2.5 out of 3, and now she's at 3.5 out of 4 with a lead in the tournament. She's performing quite well. And Vaishali, unfortunately, is now at 1 out of 4, having drawn only 2 games and lost the remaining 2. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at the next game, which is between Divya Deshmukh and Carissa Yip. Carissa Yip having the white pieces. Carissa comes into the round with a score of 1.5 out of 3, while Divya comes in the round with a score of 2 out of 3. And let's go ahead and take a look at the games. Again, Carissa is the reigning Cairns Cup champion, so she is looking to defend her title. Using pawn to b4, pawn to d6, and we get a Philidor defense, where here, even though you can capture on e5 and trade queens, typically this is considered perfectly fine for black, because there's just not all that much that you get out of the position, even though it is an endgame. Really, it's just kind of a slow position where all the pawns are on the same side. Rather, they're all in the same structure, so it's very symmetric. And neither side really has much of an advantage. Stuff like this might happen, and it's just quite equal. So that's why most people don't play into that. Instead, Carissa plays for knight f3, trying to find an edge in the position. And she plays this move a4, which is very thematic, trying to take some space and prevent black's own expansion, while also giving this c4 bishop a square on a2. So this is also kind of a theme in the Italian, and it's employed very similarly in other positions where you try to take space in the center. Here we get the move pawn to c6, rook to e1, pawn to h6, pawn to h3, and both players are simply trying to take some space in the center. Rather, they're trying to create some play in the center. And after the move bishop to e6, bishop to f4, Divya decides to play for queen to a5. Divya's up a little bit on time here, and we get the move bishop to f1. Carissa decides against trading the bishops, although there was a very interesting move here where Carissa could have played the move pawn to b4, which on the surface seems like it just loses a pawn, but because of the desperado, it actually is simply getting equal material. You're winning the pawn back, and then this d6 pawn can be quite weak, so for that reason black is supposed to play d5 here, but rook to b1 comes in, knight to g6 is actually the only move, and now after bishop to d2, even though this pawn is under fire, pawn to b6 and knight takes c6, there is simply knight takes c4, knight takes c4, pawn takes, and it is still in the balance. However, white is doing better because white does win a pawn here. However, black can still get quite active and offer trade rooks. King takes, and this is all relatively fine for both sides. White is doing better, but black is still maybe okay. However, it's not very practical to calculate all of this out in a classical game, even though you do have the time, but it's a bit of a difficult position to understand, and for that reason, Carissa, I'm guessing that she probably saw this move, but just didn't want to go for it. And here we get the move pawn to d5 by Divya, and after pawn to e5, knight to h7, queen to d2, bishop to f5, get knight to d4, and even though Carissa didn't go for the absolute best try, this is still a bit of an unpleasant position for Divya. After bishop to g5, bishop takes, knight takes, we have some kingside play being created by Carissa, and now Divya's getting a little bit low on the clock, trying to figure out the best way to play the position. After this, after knight to d6, rook to e7, knight takes f7, king takes f7. Here, Carissa is winning the knight back, and she is a pawn up, but with the move queen to b4, Divya is going to be winning the pawn back, unless you want to play a move like rook to b1, but that's a little bit passive. So we get the move queen to d3. Divya doesn't want to take the pawn yet because it does run into some concrete problems with rook to b1, queen to a3, and knight takes d5, where this is a tactic that is going to be winning at least an exchange for white. Kind of a theme that you also see in the accelerated dragon in many lines. But we get the move rook to f8, pawn to b3, queen to g3, and after pawn takes, knight to g6, pawn to e4, trade. And it's a very symmetric position now, so it is quite equal. However, after knight to f5, king to f2, there is still some life left, and actually, Carissa is beginning to make some of her own inroads because she's advancing on the king side and maybe creating some weaknesses that black has to address. So rook to e4, and after the move pawn to g5, there is this move h5, which is completely closing down the position. And even though it is equal material, once again, there are some problems that are being posed to Divya because there's some restriction being created around the black king. And actually, white is objectively doing very, very well here. After knight to c6, rook takes e6. Carissa could have actually even won a pawn directly by playing knight takes h6, but she chooses an even more prudent approach with the move pawn to c3, just disallowing any immediate counterplay by the black knight, because she can just capture this h-pawn at any moment. So after pawn to a6, we get knight takes h6, knight to a5 is played, and now knight f5, king to f6, and we get this check, knight takes g5, check, and a trade. So we get this move pawn to b4, and a very, very interesting choice by Carissa to actually sacrifice her knight. She probably figured that there's at least no risk going into this position, though maybe she didn't have to try to force matters like this. Maybe she could have played pawn to g6, and if something like king to h6, then g7, king to h7, h6, and maybe this could have also been a way of playing where it might not seem obvious what the point is, but after something like this, there is knight to d7, threatening knight to f6 check, and this would be winning for white. But it's a bit of an unusual construction where only the knight and pawns are doing the work. So Carissa probably wanted to find a more concrete way of playing, and she gets into this position, and the most accurate move here would have been g6 check, and I think it's actually the only winning move, where after king h6, there is pawn to b5. If captures, then pawn to b6. You cannot capture because this pawn will simply promote, and if you choose to play knight to c5, then this g pawn will simply promote. But once again, not easy to understand the nuance there. If king to g7, then again pawn to b5, and just statically it's a winning position because of this threat, and the king will march up and escort the other two pawns once the knight defends the b pawn. Alas, Carissa instead chooses to play the move king to g4, and now there's not quite a direct threat of advancement, and Divya finds an accurate move with knight to d4. Now you might wonder, why is this not the same? The point is that if g6 check, king to h6, the difference is now the king cannot try to sidestep the black king and create the threat of promotion with escorting the pawn. So this knight on d4 is actually beautifully centralized. And after king to f4, king to g7, we have an attack on the knight, and then h6, and ultimately the position ends up being a draw. So very, very good defense by Divya. She was in a dead loss position really, but it was not something that was easy to calculate out, and she was also low on time, so very impressive resilience by her. Divya is now at 2.5 out of 3 with this draw, and Carissa is at 2 out of 4. So both players doing relatively well in this tournament with the level of competition. And we can move on to the third game in the women's section, the Cairns Cup, which is between Stavroula Kidu. Sorry, I always have some trouble pronouncing her name, and Alice Lee. So in this game, Stavroula chose to play the move pawn to d4, and we got a London system, which is maybe not as common as it used to be in top-level chess, but it is absolutely an interesting way of playing. So we get knight to b5 and queen to c5. And this version of the London is definitely something that could be a little bit dangerous for black, because this pawn on e4 can advance to e5 at any moment and create some ideas of a Greek gift on h7. So what happens is we get c3, knight takes c3, and after rook to d8, we do actually get the move pawn to e5, because if you capture on e5, then you run into the tactic of bishop takes h7, and this rook on d8 is hanging, so maybe you can even start with knight takes e5 first, just so you don't have knight takes f3 check happening, and it would be a losing position for black. So here we get knight to d5, and Alice maybe missed just how powerful continuation was for white. Stavroula, however, didn't find the most accurate move, where she played the move knight to e4, but actually the move bishop takes h7, immediately going for the Greek gift, was actually a winning attempt. And after knight to g5 check, you may wonder what happens in these lines. So if king to h6, then knight c to e4, and queen to g4, queen to h4 creates some very, very difficult threats to deal with. And after knight to g5, king to g6, queen to c2 check is actually winning for white, because black kind of has to take on g5, but then there's just this fork of the king and the rook, the king and the queen. So black would have had to play king to g8. If king h8, then you simply allow queen h5 check with force, and it's just really a losing position. Something like this, it's actually a forced mate, and you would have the game end like this. So you would have to have king h8 be played, but then knight c to e4, and you have some similar problems where queen to h5 happens, and then knight takes e5, but queen h7, king to f8, queen h8, king to e7, queen takes g7, and this knight is hit. This pawn is under threat if the knight moves, so bishop to d7, you would take this knight, and you might say, well, what if I just defend this knight with, say, queen to c7, but then the problem is f4. The only way you can defend this knight is via the queen, unfortunately for black, and any way of doing so simply relinquishes the pin on the f-pawn other than queen to d4, but then king to h1, and you renew the threat of f4. So I guess you may wonder what happens if rook to f8, but still, I guess f4 actually isn't good here, because just knight to c6, and now things are defended. But the problem is rook a to d1, and now instead of hitting f7, your idea is that you are going to just win the knight, at the very least. And also you can probably sack the rook, I'm guessing. Maybe not here, but oh, sorry, the queen to c5 just hangs the queen, but like queen to b6, and I guess maybe here you can sack the rook. In any case, it would have actually been a winning position for Stavroula. However, she wasn't quite able to calculate it all out, so she ended up playing knight to e4, queen to b4, queen c1, and still had some dynamics in the position, but she is pressuring regardless, and she finds this brilliant knight to f6 check, where after e takes f6, the queen is simply threatening to come in and create some very difficult problems for the black king. After h6, bishop takes f5 was played. She should have maybe played the move pawn to g4 and just said that she's going to remove the defender of the pawn and then take on h6, but also not 100% clear that this is even good for white. She should here actually play the queen to c4, with the point that after captures, there would be queen takes f7 and a mate. But again, not the clearest way of playing. If queen takes d3 here, then there's queen takes b2, and even though you win this piece, you're not clearly better. Rather, you're not clearly winning. Ultimately, though, we get bishop takes f5, and here black had to capture on b2, which is a very, very difficult move to play, because you simply feel that you're not getting the piece back. However, it's okay to just play down position where you're trying to get this f6 pawn, and maybe this could still have been holdable, where even though the black king is quite weak, it is ultimately an extra pawn for black, and the white king is not under immediate threat. The material otherwise is even, so could have been a reasonable try for black, but Alice decides to just take the bishop, and this is a very strong move that Stavroula found, which is queen to d6. Now, if something like bishop to e6 is trying to develop, there's queen to g3, and the rook actually ends up being lost. So that was maybe what Alice missed, that this queen is able to reroute to g3 and create some very, very nasty threats. And ultimately bishop to e6 ended up being played, and after king to f8, Stavroula played an even more clinical move with rook to d1, arguing that now queen g7, queen to g8 will be a checkmate. So queen to c5 was played. Now Alice is saying that she will block with queen to f8 if given the chance. However, Stavroula was accurate and found the pawn to b4. She likely saw this in advance. So then now, if the queen is defected off the diagonal, then we simply checkmate with queen g7 and queen g8. So Alice sacrifices on b4 to keep the queen on the diagonal, but now after rook to d6, it won't be able to control the relevant squares, and the queen really just has to sacrifice itself to not get the king, to prevent the black king from getting checkmated immediately, but this is completely winning for white. So a very nice game by Stavroula, who moves to a score of 2.5 out of 4, and is among the leaders of the tournament, just behind Zhongyi. Okay, for the last game, let's go ahead and take a look at this game between Bibisara and Alexandra Kosteniuk. Bibisara, a very strong speed player and strong classical player. Alexandra, former women's world champion. And here we go. Bibisara comes in the round with 3 draws, and Alexandra is actually winless coming into this round, so she is still looking to end up on the board. And we get the knight to f3, pawn to d5, c4, and we get this Blumenfeld variation. I believe this is the Blumenfeld for white, and we get f takes e3. This Blumenfeld variation was featured in the match between Gukesh and Ding, I believe. I believe it was Gukesh that was playing from the white side, unless I'm mistaken. And it was a game, it ended up being a very, very dynamic game, where I think Gukesh got an opening advantage, but ultimately it fizzled out to a draw. Hopefully I'm remembering that part correctly. But in this game, we have the move c takes b4, and just a note that the Blumenfeld can actually be played from both sides. It's actually a very, very underrated gambit, in my opinion, for black, because there are many defenses for d4 that can be quite combative, but a lot of them are objectively unsound, and the Blumenfeld is actually objectively quite sound, according to engine analysis. So if you are looking for a dynamic opening that is not a standard way of playing for black against d4, then you should absolutely try out the Blumenfeld. I prepped the Blumenfeld myself quite a bit and found it to be a very, very fun opening. There's a lot of very interesting ideas within the game, and even engines have found this opening to be quite sound in like top level engine play between like computers like AlphaZero and LC0. Okay, so here we have the move pawn to d4, and we get some development with bishop to b2. And after the move queen to e7, you can see that white gets some very, very dangerous central play with pawn to b4, and I think that you really have to strike back here with pawn to e5 and not just allow white to overrun you with the pawn to e5 and getting just a dominant central advantage where Greek wave sacrifices could emerge, just pressure on f7. Everything would be good for white in that position, so Alexandra decides to play for e5 as is kind of necessary, but Bibisara finds a very nice way of playing with pawn to c5, bishop to b8, and pawn to d5, and now these pawns are simply going through the board, and Alexandra has to really sacrifice, she has to sacrifice the piece, I believe. No, she takes on c5 with check to lure the king away, and then she moves a knight. But now, after a takes b4, bishop to a3, this is simply a positionally lost game, where this bishop on a3 is so strong that castles is not actually possible, because bishop takes e7 will happen. So knight bd2, and just the position plays itself. Knight to g4 is played, but simply knight to b4, knight to f2 check, and rook takes f2. Now the problem is that queen a4 check comes in, and after bishop to d7, we see queen to b4, threatening ideas along this diagonal. And after knight to g6 takes, Alexandra is simply lost, because bishop f1, this rook on a8 will be captured in a moment's notice. You can't even castle as black, so this is simply losing. And Bibisara plays really a beautiful game in the Blumenfeld Gambit as white. So very, very impressive by Bibisara, who moves to a score of 2.5 out of 4 as well. So just to recap the standings, we had 3 decisive games between Stavroula and Alice, by Bibisara and Alexandra Kosteniuk, and Zhongyi and Vaishali. Carissa, Yip, and Divya drew, even though Carissa had a winning position there, and then Humpy and Anna Musichuk ended up drawing their game, which was a little bit less eventful. So in the standings, we have Zhongyi at 3.5, Alice, Stavroula, Bibisara, Divya all at 2.5, Anna Musichuk, Carissa, Yip at 2, Humpy at 1.5, Vaishali at 1, and Alexandra Kosteniuk, unfortunately, at 0 out of 4. And still looking to get on the board. But we've got some very exciting games in the Cairns Cup, with how variable the games can end up being. So some very nice games that we got to analyze today. If you enjoy the content of this channel, feel free to like and subscribe. Otherwise, hope you have a nice day, and I'll see you for recap of round 5. Take care.